Hey everyone, it's the Capes Clinician, and let's have a quick chat about that Wolverine trailer. I usually put in a lot of effort to script my videos, but this one is just going to be a bit off the cuff, which I thought would be fun. I just want to have a quick ramble about that Wolverine trailer, talk about my thoughts, my hopes, my expectations about the game, and then you guys can leave yours in the comments as well. So I wanted to start by just talking about what the appeal of Wolverine is as a character, because I think it's actually more complicated of a question than people give it credit for. Now, of course, he's got that classic persona, doesn't he? That grouchy personality, that grumbly, dark, gravelly voice, and he's a part of a superhero team, the X-Men. But he's a bit darker than most of the other members of the X-Men. Now, those things that I mentioned about Wolverine are kind of applicable to a lot of different characters. Now, what's the difference between Wolverine and Batman? Batman's grumbly and gravelly, and he's been part of superhero teams, and he's certainly darker than most other DC superheroes. Well, in my opinion, the difference between Wolverine and Batman is actually quite clear. You see, Batman dresses like a bat, but he doesn't really have any animalistic aspects to his character. Sure, he might have leaned more into animalistic tendencies in things like Batman, Venom, and certainly when he's on different drugs in the comics, he might be more of an animal type character, but he's not like Wolverine. And Batman is inherently just a normal human being. He doesn't have aspects to him that make him superhuman. So I think that's the difference between Batman and Wolverine. While Batman is just a human, taken up to a certain extreme, Wolverine is inherently superhuman, and he battles with those differences between being a man and being something different, something more primal than a man. But what about Wolverine and Moon Knight? Moon Knight has different aspects to him. Moon Knight has some degree of a supernatural power, and then Moon Knight is imbued with powers from the Egyptian god Khonshu, or maybe he isn't and he's just crazy. But there is a difference between Wolverine and Moon Knight, even though Moon Knight has also been on teams of superheroes. Most recently in Jed MacKay's run on Moon Knight runs the Midnight Mission, with other heroes like Tigra and 8-Ball. But the difference between Wolverine and Moon Knight is the fact that, again, Wolverine taps into an animalistic side. Now, Moon Knight taps into a supernatural side to his powers, but Wolverine has that animal nature. And that's, again, the difference between Wolverine and Daredevil. Now, Daredevil is just as angry as Wolverine in several stories in the comics, most notably, in my opinion, during the Red Fist saga, which is a recent story by Chip Zdarsky and Marco Cicchetto. It's a very fascinating story where Daredevil taps into some supernatural powers through the powers of the Beast. He even goes directly into hell in order to save Foggy Nelson during the dramatic climax of that story. But the difference between Daredevil and Wolverine again comes back to that dichotomy, that juxtaposition that makes Wolverine so compelling. The man and the mammal, the man and the animal. That's what makes Wolverine so appealing, in my opinion. So we get it, right? Wolverine is this animal and also a man at the same time. He represents this very interesting story of the struggle of any man to be more than themselves, to be the best version of themselves. That's what I think is so heightened in reality with Wolverine stories. I think that's why he's such an appealing character. But if that is what makes Wolverine appealing, how do we know that Insomniac games are going to capture that in their video game? Well, let's actually start breaking down the trailer and find out for ourselves, shall we? So the setting of the game looks to be in two major places, and the first of which is Madripoor. Madripoor we actually saw in Deadpool and Wolverine very briefly. In the sequence where Deadpool is trying to find different versions of Logan from different points in the timeline, we see a version of Logan called Patch, that version of Hugh Jackman's Wolverine with a white suit and an eye patch on. And that was Wolverine when he was living it up in Madripoor, and we can see that on some classic comic book covers as well. But the other major location we can see is the wilderness. Now, it's unclear if this is the Canadian wilderness, and I mention Canada because that's where Wolverine is so prominently located in his solo adventures, but nevertheless, we do see Wolverine in the wilderness. And I think that will be really crucial for narrative exploration and deconstruction of Logan as we go on. I think it's fascinating to see how Logan relates to different animals in the wilderness. A recent example of that would be in Saladin Ahmed's run on Wolverine. This is in the From the Ashes era of the X-Men, where Wolverine essentially tries to cure a Wendigo who's not completely transformed into a mindless and monstrous beast. I think it's such a fascinating way to explore Logan's character. And I think Madripoor is just as interesting, although it doesn't seem it on the surface. And Madripoor might seem like a generic city, but it's actually so much more than that. If we think about Madripoor, it's almost like Las Vegas in real life. It's a place where people go and they're pretty disinhibited. They can kind of go crazy, they gamble, they party, they spend a heck of a lot of money, and that's essentially what Madripoor is like. It's a bit grungy, it's a bit off the radar, and I think that's an exploration of what happens when people are out of control, what happens when people don't really use their common sense so much, and that's a really fascinating place to put Logan. How does Logan manage manage his animal impulses when in an environment like that? How can Logan control himself when everybody around him is uncontrolled? I think it's so fascinating. Would Logan be more willing to get a bit more rough in bar fights at the Princess Bar than he would be if he was in New York? I think both of these settings are very, very good in terms of exploring Logan as a character on a level that's deeper than just that surface level personality that I was mentioning at the beginning of the video. And beyond just the setting, we see a couple of really, really famous Wolverine characters in this trailer. So let's break down who those characters are, how they might fold into the story, and what other villains we might expect to see as well from the little Easter eggs that we see. First up is Mystique. Now I think she's the one that people recognize the most from the trailer. It's the one that got the biggest reaction online, and for good reason. Mystique is such an interesting character. Her power set is really cool. If you don't know Mystique, she was in some of the Fox X-Men movies, and I think she's returning for Avengers Doomsday as well. She has shape-shifting abilities, and that makes her really fascinating as a character for that ability to misdirect and challenge what we think we know about our story and our characters. Second up is Omega Red, and I think this is a character that's a bit lesser known, but it's a really, really popular character in the Wolverine mythos. Omega Red has carbonadium coils, which are these metal, almost tentacle-like weapons that he uses to fight Wolverine in the trailer. And carbonadium is a particularly interesting metal. As you probably know, Wolverine has an adamantium skeleton. That means that his bones are reinforced with this really unique metal, and carbonadium is the only metal on Earth that's able to really, really harm Wolverine. So that's why Omega Red is such a formidable threat, and that's why he's such a fascinating character to be included in this story. And I wonder if Omega Red and Mystique have a link to each other, if they're being controlled by some higher organization, and in fact, I think they probably do. Now there's been a lot of speculation online as to the identities of these mechanized soldiers that we see in the trailer for Wolverine, and I think the conclusion that people have arrived at is that they are the Reavers. But who are the Reavers, and how could it spell the beginning of a more significant story for Wolverine than we might have previously imagined? Now, the Reavers are a squad of mechanized soldiers, as I mentioned, but they're usually contracted by the Hellfire Club. Now, the Hellfire Club is a more obscure part of X-Men lore, and a couple of the members of the Hellfire Club appeared most recently in X-Men 97. Now, the Hellfire Club is a shadow organization of mutants that controls social and political orders across the world in secret. Most prominently, the Hellfire Club appeared in the Marauders series, which was a series coming out in the Krakoa era of the X-Men. It was one of my favorite series during the Krakoa era, and it featured characters like Emma Frost, who you might know from Marvel Rivals, and also other characters like Kitty Pryde, Bishop, and Iceman. So why is the inclusion of the Hellfire Club really significant for the story of Marvel's Wolverine? Well, it builds up the idea that Insomniac have a vast universe of mutants that they're slotting Wolverine into. Instead of Wolverine being our real introduction to these characters, it feels like they've been around for quite a long time. So what other characters could be appearing in this game to build up this universe even more? A pair of characters I'd really love to see get adapted for this game are Yukio and Mariko Yoshida, who are both love interests for Wolverine in the comics, most prominently in the Wolverine Solo series, which was written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by Frank Miller. These two characters represented two sides of a coin in terms of their affection for Logan. Mariko was from a noble family in Japan, and she loved Wolverine for his ferocity, but his ability to temper his ferocity with compassion and calm. Yukio came in after it appeared that Wolverine's relationship with Mariko was done for, and Yukio was a more ruthless character who loved Wolverine for his pure, untapped ferocity and his ability to kill. Yukio is a very interesting character because she really contrasts with Mariko, and Wolverine still pining for Mariko, even in the presence of Yukio, shows that Wolverine always has this pursuit of being more noble, being a better version of himself, and I think that's integral to any good Wolverine story. But yes, there's an elephant in the room, and those elephants are called the X-Men. Will we see any members of the X-Men in this game, and which members would I like to see appear? Well, I could say pretty much anybody. I could say Professor X, Magneto, Mr. Sinister, Apocalypse, but those wouldn't be reasonable characters to suggest. Ultimately, this is Wolverine's introductory game, and so any X-Men character who would appear needs to have more personal ties intrinsically to either Logan or the other mutants that we're seeing appear in this game. So my two picks are these. Nightcrawler would be the first one. Nightcrawler is a fascinating character because, again, he represents some aspect of somebody trying to temper themselves with a higher force or a higher calling. Nightcrawler, in this case, trying to temper his own innate appearance as a devil with religion. He's a devout Catholic. Now, Nightcrawler is actually the biological son of Mystique, and that's why I think it would be a really fascinating way to tie Nightcrawler into this universe. Not attaching him directly to the X-Men, but instead attaching him to Mystique, fleshing out her motivations a little bit more. Perhaps Nightcrawler is quite young in this universe, and Mystique is doing what she's doing in order to provide for her newborn son. And the other character that I think could appear with a more direct tie to Logan would be Jean Grey. Now, Jean Grey is a really famous member of the X-Men, perhaps most famous for being the Dark Phoenix in the comic books and those two really awful movie adaptations of the Phoenix Saga. But Jean Grey could appear in this game. I don't quite see how she would appear, maybe in some kind of of post-credit scene, a cameo appearance, but Jean Grey does have a personal tie to Logan. They've got a very on-again, off-again relationship, and it would make the most sense for her to appear compared to any other member of the X-Men, like Charles Xavier or Cyclops. But I think that when people think about the X-Men, and they say, would other members of the X-Men show up in this game, they might even be thinking too small. What about other Marvel heroes that do exist but haven't been seen yet in the Insomniac universe? Now, I say other heroes, but I'm kind of beating around the bush. I'm thinking about one hero, the Hulk. It would be a very obvious inclusion to put the Hulk in this game. After all, Wolverine was first introduced as a cameo in The Incredible Hulk issue 180 before making his full appearance in Incredible Hulk number 181. It would be quite fun to reverse the origin relationship in this case, having Insomniac's version of the Hulk originate in a Wolverine game to then spin off into his own series. And how about Insomniac's other hero, Spider-Man, either Peter or Miles? How could Wolverine interact with Spider-Man? How do those stories connect together? Well, honestly, I'm not quite sure how you would connect to Miles Morales. Miles is a much newer character than Peter in the comics, and he's not had many significant interactions with Wolverine. If you want to tie into the legacy angle, maybe we could introduce X-23 in a future game and have her team up with Miles. I think that would be a really nice way to highlight the significance of legacy heroes in the industry, with Miles as the legacy Spider-Man and X-23 becoming the legacy Wolverine, while not stepping on Miles' toes just yet. It seems like he'll be the lead character for Insomniac's Spider-Man 3, and I don't want to interfere with his story too much. So what about Peter and Logan? Well, they actually do have a little bit of a history in the comics, but not as much as you might expect. A story that I absolutely love is the original Secret Wars from 1984, and in the third issue of that story, Spider-Man absolutely walked all over the X-Men, including Wolverine. So that's a fun little bit of Marvel trivia for you. Other than that, Spider-Man and Wolverine have shared the screen in the Spider-Man 90s animated series during the arc Neogenic Nightmare, which was in season 2. I'm actually watching through that right now, but Wolverine appeared in the earlier episodes, The Mutant Agenda and Mutant's Revenge. It's a really fun story. It has Morbius in it. No, not the Jared Leto kind, but it's a generally good story. I don't think Insomniac would adapt from there though, so how about something else? Well, most of Spider-Man and Wolverine's team-ups have been in Avengers books, like in Brian Michael Bendis' Avengers and New Avengers series, but how could Wolverine actually come to New York and interact with Peter? Well, there's a recent Spider-Man-Wolverine team-up book going on right now, and they took an interesting angle exploring Logan's past in the context of Peter Parker's parents. Now you might not know this, but Peter's parents were S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, and Wolverine also had a bit of a history with S.H.I.E.L.D. and other spy agencies. They posited that maybe Wolverine was the one who killed Peter's parents. It kind of ended in a bit of a mess, but there is some opportunity for storytelling there. Other than that, in Spider-Man 2, there's a secret side quest where you can find out that the Chameleon is actually at large in New York. Wolverine does have hunting abilities after all, so maybe Wolverine could be worked into a side quest in Marvel's Spider-Man 3. Overall, I think Insomniac appeared to be doing a really good job with Marvel's Wolverine. And I wasn't much of a fan of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, but this looks to be writing the course with their Marvel adaptations, giving us a fresh take on Wolverine while still reminding us of what makes Wolverine work as a character. I hope you really enjoyed my speculations on what characters could appear and how the universe could all fit together, and please leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm really excited to hear what you think and other things that you're excited about with Marvel's Wolverine. See you next time.